Thank you, Dean, and thanks to Nikolai, and thank you to the Clinton School for having me. This is my first time in Arkansas, and so I'm kind of profoundly humbled to be able to address a school of public service, especially because my book is about activists who really believe in the notion of public service, perhaps in a way that some of you and many people, I think, around the country may not agree with, but nevertheless, they operate in the spirit of that. I hope you don't consider it inauthentic that I'm going to read some of my remarks. I'm a writer, I'm not a lecturer or a public speaker. So to keep myself kind of on task, I've got some remarks. I worked on this book from early 2013 to early 2016. And for most of that time, I figured it'd be difficult to get people interested in the topic of nuclear weapons. They seemed like a relic of an earlier era, a threat that had turned into a bit of an anachronism. And then in the past year, a confluence of factors have renewed our interest in a problem we've grappled with for 72 years now. It is, I would argue, the problem that we face. We face it every second of every day. Whether we recognize it or not. My book is about this threat. In the era of global terrorism, we are used to threats, anxiety, paranoia, radicalism. The threat of nuclear weapons, though, I would argue, is more primal, more existential, and more total. It reveals something about us, about our humanity. And so my book is also about individuals, physicists, presidents, and most centrally activists, as I mentioned. I should say, by way of introduction, that I'm speaking only on my behalf, not on behalf of the Washington Post. I wrote a book about nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear activism, but I did not and do not cover these subjects for the Post, nor do I have a news beat that's related to the military, to energy, to national security, to activism, to physics, or to any topic that my book touches. Some of you here, maybe most of you here, know more about this topic than I do. So please forgive me for speaking in an elementary way about it. In my work at the Post, I'd like to think that I specialize in rendering complicated topics in a human way. And that's what I try to do with this book. I'm not an expert, I'm a curious citizen. So I'm going to talk to you for 25 or 30 minutes about how a curious citizen tried to learn more about nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear activism. So I have to start with myself. I was born into a world that was obsessed with nuclear weapons. I was born in September of 1983, over a year after 1 million people marched in New York against nuclear weapons. It works, there it is. And I was born 2 months before 100 million people watched the ABC TV movie The Day After, which depicted in graphic detail the effects of a major nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. So in prime time, those of us who were not old enough to see this, you can actually watch the entirety of it on YouTube right now. But in prime time, 100 million Americans watched Kansas be decimated in a nuclear war. 2 weeks after I was born, a Soviet Air Force lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov in a bunker outside Moscow was informed that 6 American nuclear missiles were on their way to decapitate his country's leadership. There they were, as plain as day, on the radar, and according to protocol, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov should have sent word up the chain so the Soviets could decide how to retaliate and perhaps take out some American cities and missile fields before their own arsenal was ruined. But without much more than limited data and his own instinct, Petrov declared it to be a false alarm. And it was. The Soviet early warning system had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds as 6 incoming nuclear missiles. Petrov was reassigned to a less important post and then pressured to take early retirement, punishment for essentially not starting the process of a misbegotten nuclear war that would have killed tens of millions of people. Yesterday, Russian media reported that Petrov died in May. at age 77. He was called the man who saved the world. There was a documentary that came out 3 years ago called The Man Who Saved the World. And he did so 34 years ago next week, a week from tomorrow. He made the call. Most of the world didn't know about this incident at the time. I certainly didn't. I was 2 weeks old. But it was emblematic of how close we've come over the years to nuclear destruction. The dean mentioned the Damascus Incident in 1980. Perhaps some of you have read Eric Schlosser's book, Command and Control. So we were kind of used to these kinds of close calls as a planet, without kind of knowing it in a public way. So that's the world I was born into. The world I came of age in after the Cold War ended, the specter of nuclear weapons seemed past and not present. They were a paragraph in a textbook. We dropped the bomb on Japan, and the worst war in history came to an end. The bomb killed many people, but they saved many more. That was the common wisdom. I didn't think much about nuclear weapons until August 2012, when a colleague of mine at the Post sent a story to my part of the newsroom. Her name was Dana Priest. She was a national security reporter at the time, and she'd been working on a series of stories about how our nuclear arsenal was aging and needed refurbishment. And she had visited a weapons facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, called the Y-12 National Security Complex. Before I tell you about Y-12, I should note that our nuclear arsenal requires a series of labs and plants spread out across the country. You may have heard of Los Alamos. That's one of the nuclear weapons labs in New Mexico. Anyway, Y-12 is one of those plants. You can see it right there in Tennessee. It's located in the city of Oak Ridge, just outside of Knoxville. Oak Ridge was created in 1942 out of thin air, almost overnight, to host tens of thousands of people needed to work on the Manhattan Project. Oak Ridge's assignment was to enrich the uranium for the first atomic weapons. It was nicknamed, the city I mean, it was nicknamed the Secret City because no one outside of it knew it existed. And the people who worked there had no idea what they were working on. Oak Ridge was the headquarters of the Manhattan Project, which of course was the race to build the atomic bomb before Hitler. And Oak Ridge and Y-12 still exist today, and for much the same reason. Without Oak Ridge, we would not have nuclear bombs, then or now. My colleague, Dana, noted that Y-12 was a bit run down in 2012. Roofs leaked, buildings were as old as World War II, and made of wood. It was an environment that should have been more put together, to say the least, given that it houses what is perhaps the greatest stockpile of fissile material on the planet. Half an hour from Knoxville. Tons and tons of highly enriched uranium in a big white building. There it is. This building, one of the newer structures at this Y-12 facility, can allegedly withstand the impact of a commercial jet. It's surrounded by 3 alarmed fences and adorned with turrets, housing guards who are authorized to shoot intruders on site. Shortly after my colleague visited this facility, on July 28th, 2012, in the middle of the night, 3 peace activists hiked a wooded ridge, cut through the 3 alarmed fences, and they reached that big white building with alarming ease. There they sprinkled human blood and spray-painted biblical messages on the exterior, and then they essentially waited to be arrested. My colleague, aware of this serious breach of nuclear security, thought another reporter should look into it, and the story found its way to me. As I've admitted already, I knew nothing about nuclear weapons or Y-12, but one aspect of this incident caught my eye immediately. One of the intruders was an 82-year-old Catholic sister named Megan Rice. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. The nuns that I was familiar with were law-abiding and rule-enforcing. So I was quite taken by the notion of a felonious octogenarian nun who helped to penetrate what's supposed to be one of the most secure facilities in the country. I met Sister Megan for the first time in October 2012, and I've spent the last 4 or 5 years listening to her life, researching her life, writing about it. The same with her 2 fellow intruders and activists, Michael Wally and Greg Borgie-Obed. I wanted to know how and why they did what they did, why they chose to risk their lives, and you might say the lives of others, in order to send a message that the mere existence of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity. This break-in forms the axis of my book. I'll just read, if you'll indulge me, a short section from chapter 4, which is titled The Miracle, just to give you a quick sense of kind of the tone of the book. So this is kind of mid-intrusion as it's happening. The second fence was intimidating. The one on the backside of the ridge was just a perimeter fence, but the 3 fences surrounding the target were clearly integrated into the site's electronic security system. The first and third fences were topped with angled rows of barbed wire. The second fence, about 20 feet from the others, was threaded with fiber optic motion sensors crowned with taut sensor cables that shimmered in the floodlight. The fences were made only of chain link. They had cut through the first one with ease. The second one, though, might be electrified. A single cut could trip an alarm. There were cameras watching them. It was around 4:15 a.m., and now it was only a matter of time. They had paused in an avenue of small white rocks between the first and the second fences. Michael had hung a cloth banner on the back side of the first fence. On it, they'd painted a fat black bomb that looked like the one that was dropped over Nagasaki. It was falling into red flames. Never again was painted below in small capital letters. Now Greg was facing the second fence, bolt cutters in hand, his heart sinking. This is not going to work, he thought. We are not going to get through this. As his hopes deflated, an inner voice piped up. Well, you won't know unless you try. Through the years, other activists had faced similar obstacles at weapons sites and had somehow made it through. Greg had been arrested more than 40 times for civil disobedience and had seen some remarkable things in his previous 5 break-ins at weapons sites. So he started cutting with his $25 red-handled bolt cutters from True Value, making sure to avoid the sensor wiring that he could see. The cutters bit down on the metal 1 link at a time. Crack, release, crack, release, crack, release. No alarms, no team of armored men, no vehicles screeching around the corner. Inside the castle-like turrets on the corners of the highly enriched uranium materials facility were guards and guns, but they did not stir. Somewhere on the premises were armored cars mounted with 6-barreled Gatling guns that could fire 50 finger-sized bullets per second, a fusillade that could down an airplane. In terms of artillery, Y-12 was prepared for an armed assault by multiple intruders. While he pulled back the flap of fencing for Megan, Greg was moved by the silence and the ease of their mission. God is with us, he thought. This is grace. The book is my effort to understand these activists, to understand the issue that drives them, to understand this grace that Greg was talking about. The book starts in Manhattan in the 30s. Which is where and when Sister Megan was born, and goes all the way up to the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima in 2015. This is the wingspan of the nuclear age. I mentioned the nuclear age in my subtitle. Until the nuclear age, mankind's intellect had powerfully aided our survival. That's something that Carl Sagan said. Tools, sanitation, refrigeration, medicine, mechanics. It was not until the invention of the atomic bomb, you could argue, that mankind had thought up a way to obliterate itself wholesale. The title of the book, Almighty, comes from a quotation by General Thomas Farrell, who was the deputy of the Manhattan Project. He witnessed the first atomic test ever in July 1945 in New Mexico. And after the whole sky filled with a white light that had never been seen before on Earth before, General Farrell spoke of, and I'll quote him, "the strong, sustained, awesome roar which warned of doomsday and made us feel that we puny things were blasphemous to dare tamper with the forces heretofore reserved to the Almighty." Mankind's reckoning with godlike power is kind of the central theme of my book. We've attained a godlike power, but not a godlike ability to control that power. And over the course of the nuclear age, I follow Michael to Vietnam, where he served two deployments and saw combat. And I follow Greg to an apprenticeship with the Berrigan brothers. I trace the Catholic left from Dorothy Day to the Plowshares Movement. The Plowshares Movement, for those of you who don't know, is this intrepid strain of civil disobedience that involves doing exactly what these three people did: showing up to a weapons site, breaking in, and beginning both the symbolic and literal work of disarmament in a concrete way. Here's one of the banners they strung up at this facility in Oak Ridge. Plowshares, of course, comes from the book of Isaiah. And these activists take these words literally. And so what they did when they broke into this facility in Oak Ridge is begin that work of disarmament in their view. In the book, I describe how Washington reacted to the break-in and how Washington functions and malfunctions in the realm of nuclear weapons. I learned that Congress is as inattentive to nuclear weapons as the public is at large. And it's not hard to understand why. We have entrusted the most awesome power to something quite clumsy: bureaucracy. This amazing piece of art is my first attempt to understand the various government departments, agencies, and offices that contribute to the arsenal. And I should note, this is not correct. Some of this is not correct. This is my first stab at trying to figure it out, but I'm quite proud of it. It's easy to forget while looking at something like this that the fate of the Earth is contained in it. For example, the Department of Energy, DOE, sounds vague and pleasant, but it is really the Department of Nuclear Weapons. 63% of the Department of Energy's budget is related to nuclear weapons and defense and cleanup, while 7% is for energy efficiency, and less than 1% is for the power grid and coal. Remember that when you hear Rick Perry talk about coal. He's really running a department that is majority about nuclear weapons. That's Washington for you, and Washington is in charge of these weapons. The Washington ethos, I think, can be summed up in one quote from Robert Joseph, who was a top arms control official in George W. Bush's State Department, and I will quote him. He said this in DC at one summit on nuclear weapons. He said, "We must recognize the world as it is and not as we hope it might be." The world as it is and the world as it should be is one of the core tensions in my book. This is a story about prophecy. And what is activism but a form of prophecy? A person or group envisioning a world different and perhaps better from the one that we live in. The story is also about faith. Faith is what drove Megan and Michael and Greg to break into Y-12, and faith is also what perpetuates our nuclear arsenal. Washington has faith in nuclear weapons. It has faith that they have prevented World War III from happening, that they are the foundation of our national security. I was fascinated by this duality, the faith that drives anti-nuclear activists and the faith that comforts Pentagon officials and presidents. This book is based on a long story I wrote for the Post in 2013, and the title of that piece was The Prophets of Oak Ridge. The town of Oak Ridge, as the legend goes, was foretold by its own prophet, a man named John Hendricks, who had a vision back around the turn of the century about a great city that would help win the greatest war that ever was. And a century later, in come Megan, Michael, and Greg, who envisioned the dismantlement of that city and the redirection of Oak Ridge's money and resources to life-giving enterprises. In between those visions is a person like Barack Obama, who both saw where we need to go in the future and what realism requires in the meantime. He was, as all presidents are, the executive of a nation of laws, not a nation of men. And it was the law that most fascinated me in this story. Congress, after this break-in, held a bunch of hearings. That's what Congress does best. And they actually thanked the peace activists. But the executive branch, of course, prosecuted them. Megan, Michael, and Greg were arrested at Y-12 when security eventually showed up. And they were charged with intending to endanger the national defense. That's the charge, intending to endanger the national defense. The Department of Justice argued that their intrusion and the 2-week shutdown at Y-12 hampered national security. The trio admitted to their actions. They did not dispute that they broke into Y-12, but they pleaded not guilty. They believed they were violating a terrestrial law in the service of a higher law, that stopping Y-12 from operating was actually stopping greater crimes. They believed that the United States is non-compliant with international law and with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a 50-year-old agreement where nuclear powers pledged to negotiate the terms of disarmament if other signatories agreed not to get nuclear weapons of their own. I devoted a whole chapter to their trial. A playwright could not have scripted it better. It was like a morality play, a theatrical parable. The trial took place in Knoxville in May of 2013. The 2 assistant U.S. attorneys that prosecuted them were practicing Catholics. Amul Thapar, the judge who oversaw the case, was an impressive, demanding, and thoughtful man, a first-generation American whose Indian grandfather taught him about the civil disobedience of Gandhi. The criminal charge, remember, was intent to endanger the national defense, meaning that this trial would hinge not on what they did, but why they did it. And so in open court in 2013, activists and attorneys had a de facto debate about why we have nuclear weapons. The most stunning episode during testimony was when a U.S. attorney was asking an employee of Y-12, the site, what event ended World War II? And all of a sudden, the justice system was relitigating the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki nearly 70 years after the fact. At the very least, Megan, Michael, and Greg made the system question itself, and they did so at great personal peril. My subtitle includes the word courage, and I think that is what is required to be prophetic indeed. Around the same time of the trial, using the same exact argument, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean sued the United States and other nuclear powers for breaching the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is equidistant between Japan, Hawaii, and Australia. Those of you here in Little Rock maybe know a little bit more about the Marshall Islands than most people around the country. The largest community of Marshallese outside of the Marshall Islands is in Springdale. For other audiences, I kind of have to explain more about the Marshall Islands. But for part of this book, I went to the Marshall Islands for 11 days because I wanted to know why this small island nation was suing the United States. And you may know that from 1946 to 1958, we detonated 67 atomic bombs in the Marshall Islands. These bombs were the biggest we've ever created. The biggest of the big had an explosive yield of 15 megatons. That's 1,000 times the power of Hiroshima. That happened in 1954. The US relocated the Marshallese people in advance of the tests, but the damage was done anyway. Islands rendered uninhabitable, death and illness in populations downwind. If you were to parcel out the explosive power of these tests over the 12 years of testing evenly, it would be equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshimas every day for 12 years. That is the combined explosive. It's a lot to wrap your brain around. And the second one of these tests is the cover of my book, the underwater Baker test. Anyway, this shows all the nuclear detonations around the world over the past 72 years. So I saw 2 entities trying to hold the United States accountable for its nuclear arsenal, Megan, Michael, and Greg, who in a sense smuggled their issue into the court system through the back door, intending to put the country on trial, and the Marshall Islands, who filed suit in San Francisco in the International Court of Justice, charging that the US was non-compliant with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Megan, Michael, and Greg were convicted by a jury, and the Marshall Islands case was dismissed in San Francisco. We still use the Marshall Islands today for our missile testing. Obviously, we're not doing explosive tests there anymore, but when we fire an unarmed intercontinental ballistic missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, guess where it lands? It lands in the Marshall Islands. So we still have this very kind of fraught relationship with them. We've conducted multiple tests like that so far this year. North Korea, 2 weeks ago, conducted its 6th nuclear detonation test, estimated to be 6 times as powerful as Hiroshima. And it's working on marrying one of those warheads with a missile that can now reach the US mainland. So nuclear weapons may have receded from the collective imagination, but we and others are still actively preparing for nuclear war. And so the Marshall Islands and Megan and Michael and Greg are 2 small forces that have pushed against nuclear orthodoxy and the supremacy of superpowers. Each nuclear lab and plant has a small but vigorous group of concerned citizens who try and hold them accountable. One of the words in the book's subtitle is resistance, a word that's very much in vogue since President Trump's election, but it's a force that has always existed in the realm of nuclear weapons, from Dorothy Day to Veterans for Peace, to the Nuclear Freeze movement, to Plowshares, to citizen advocacy groups. But there are larger movements underway too. At the United Nations in July, more than 100 countries negotiated a treaty to ban nuclear weapons outright. Nuclear weapons are the only weapons of mass destruction that are not prohibited by treaty or resolution. These countries at the UN and a group of NGOs are trying to reframe the nuclear narrative. For too long, they say, the world has allowed the nuclear powers to talk about these weapons in a techno-strategic way, using jargon that obscures or dilutes what these weapons actually do when they're used. Nuclear weapons, this group of countries say, are not tools of stability. They exist only to kill millions of people. And because in their immensity, they cannot distinguish between civilians and the military, and because their effects are disproportionate and not bound by space or time, they are in violation of international law and the rules of war, except there is no precise law or treaty on the books yet to ban them. The UN right now has written that treaty, and in 2 days, this Wednesday, it opens for signatures. First, though, President Trump addresses the UN General Assembly tomorrow. So it's a busy week in that regard. I, for one, will be focused on what the president says about nuclear weapons in this address tomorrow, if he says anything. His previous remarks on the subject are, as you know or can probably imagine, somewhat contradictory. He has called them a horror, and that he would be the last to ever use them. But he has also reportedly wondered aloud why we can't use them if we have them. And last month, he threatened North Korea with a fire and fury like the world has never seen. The official position now, and also during the Obama administration, is that this effort to outlaw nuclear weapons is destabilizing, that the only way to get to zero nuclear weapons is to go very slowly, step by step, each country in concert with the other. And there is some validity to that approach. There are 14,900 nuclear weapons on the planet right now. There used to be close to 70,000. So great progress has been made. There we go. Great progress has been made. Hardworking scientists and officials have devoted their careers to the delicate work of securing loose nuclear materials, negotiating treaties that have brought down both the volume and, in some respects, the capabilities of the US and Russian stockpiles, which constitute over 90% of the weapons on the planet. But meanwhile, the cost of managing this diminishing stockpile is going up. The overall reduction of nuclear weapons is complicated by the increase in the number of countries that possess them. When the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, there were 5 nuclear powers, and now there are 9. And the rhetoric between the US and North Korea is flammable. North Korea has threatened to attack Guam and the mainland US. On Sunday, this past Sunday, yesterday, the US ambassador to the UN said if North Korea keeps on with this reckless behavior, it will be destroyed. Is this harmless posturing? When does rhetoric become truly dangerous? Should we be worried that words are being stripped of their meaning? The US alone has nearly 1,000 weapons deployed right now on bases in Europe, on top of missiles buried in Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota, in submarines that are patrolling the Atlantic and Pacific. The ones underground in the upper plains are on what's called a prompt launch setting. Critics call this hair trigger alert, but it means the same thing. They're locked and loaded and could be flying toward any spot on the planet in a matter of minutes. And once they're launched, they cannot be deactivated or recalled. If there is an incoming nuclear attack, the president has about 8 minutes to decide what to do. Can anyone make a wise, reasoned, and fully informed decision in such a short time frame? There's a lot of paradox in the realm of nuclear weapons. We say they keep the global peace by threatening the extinction of the planet every second of every day. We say that they are essential to our own national security, but other nations should not have them for their own. We say that since we can't get rid of them with a snap of a finger, we need to modernize them to make them safe and secure and reliable. President Obama in 2009 said we need to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons, but then he signed off on a $1 trillion refurbishment plan for the arsenal, which you could argue postpones that envisioned world indefinitely. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for that vision, if not for the policy currently on the books. The policy states, and I'll quote from it, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will sustain safe, secure, and effective nuclear forces. As long as nuclear weapons exist, we will have them. To me, that's a paradox. And Obama himself recognized this and articulated it in Hiroshima in 2015. He called nuclear weapons part of humanity's core contradiction. Remember Carl Sagan and General Peril. We have godlike powers now, but not a godlike ability to control them. And as Eric Schlosser says in his book on the Damascus Incident, Command and Control, human beings are imperfect, and we create imperfect machines. A nuclear weapon is an imperfect machine, and things have and do and will go wrong, as evidenced by the central incident in my book. And yet we have spent $10 trillion on them since 1940, making them our third highest budgetary priority after Social Security and non-nuclear defense spending. Think about that. Since World War II, priority number 3 for us, ahead of education, ahead of agriculture, has been nuclear weapons. Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, said last year that the world is closer to nuclear catastrophe today than it ever was during the Cold War. Think about that. Closer now than the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's tough to comprehend. His reasoning involves the possibility of accident, the possibility of miscalculation, those prompt launch missiles that are buried in Montana and North Dakota and Wyoming, the threat of nuclear terrorism. Former Senator Sam Nunn said the gravest threat is a terrorist with a nuclear weapon. So why aren't more people talking about nuclear weapons or organizing against them? Why aren't there 1 million people in Central Park like there was in 1982 if the threat is greater now? I've come to some non-scientific answers in the course of my work. One is that there are multiple generations that have grown up after the Cold War. Another is that there hasn't been an atmospheric test of a nuclear weapon since 1963. That's over 50 years without a mushroom cloud on the planet. And it's been 25 years since the last underground test in the US. And it's been 72 years last month since the last combat use of the weapons. Their effects are abstract now. And unlike with climate change, the nuclear threat does not invite individual action. It's easier to feel some agency over the climate problem. You can compost, you can get a hybrid car, you can buy carbon offsets. Little things, but you can feel like you're contributing in some way. Nuclear weapons, on the other hand, are a highly rarefied, highly classified, very technical realm of society, seemingly out of reach. They are built and kept in secret, funded by a preoccupied Congress, and the responsibility of one person, ultimately. The president has sole authority over the arsenal, which means the president can single-handedly end the world. When people ask me, do you trust Donald Trump with the nuclear codes? I respond, I don't trust anyone with the nuclear codes. So the nuclear problem seems more distant and intractable and also less visible, to me anyway. You can watch the nightly news or go on YouTube and you can watch a chunk of glacier collapse into the sea, or you can watch a small island nation like the Marshall Islands get subsumed by more voluminous tides because of sea level rise. You can't go on YouTube or the nightly news and see a nuclear detonation until, of course, it's too late. The third key word in my subtitle is existential, and there are two existential threats right now: climate change and nuclear weapons. One is gradual and visible, and the other is hidden, but would occur suddenly. And that's nuclear war, which is a scenario that would not allow for mitigation or compensatory action, which is why those actions need to happen beforehand. And that is what Megan, Michael, and Greg recognized and why they acted. That is why people gather outside of this Y12 site in Oak Ridge every Sunday to stand vigil, because they see an urgency. You cannot be urgent after nuclear weapons are used. It's then too late. So you have to be urgent now. Earlier I said that this book was an effort to understand what these three activists did and why they did it. I once listened to Sister Megan talking to a group of college students in Tennessee, and I wrote down something she said. "We are all so intertwined," she said, "and empower each other. A thought creates its own energy. The quantum theory of physics is always at work." Like atoms of uranium, an individual can begin his or her own chain reaction. I noticed that one of the Clinton School's themes or missions is building bridges, and I think that's what she means: making connections, empowering each other. We are more powerful as individuals when we link with others. There's kind of an atomic principle to human interaction in that way. Sister Megan always talked about the man who lived across the hall from her when she was growing up in Manhattan during the Depression, and then during the Manhattan Project. She grew up a couple blocks from the physics building at Columbia University, where scientists first split an atom of uranium on US soil. This neighbor across the hall, his name was Selig Hecht, and he was a professor at Columbia. And Megan remembers her parents and her neighbors whispering about the Einstein theory and the secret work that was going on at Columbia. And after the bombs were dropped on Japan, her neighbor, Dr. Hecht, wrote an essay titled Science and Moral Values, and I'll finish my remarks by quoting from that. In this essay, Dr. Hecht, the man across the hall from Sister Megan, who was 9 years old at the time, he said, he noted that every advance in civilization seems to bring its quota of disturbance. In other words, with each discovery comes both progress and peril. Dr. Hecht wrote, "Perhaps we can still achieve a happy moral order before it is too late. In order to do so, let us not rely only on social mechanisms or only on personal virtue and responsibility. Each is necessary, but neither is sufficient. With the two actively combined, we may yet emerge from our moral barbarism and achieve that spiritual integrity which our great teachers and prophets had the genius to recognize ages ago." 66 years after he wrote this, the girl who lived across the hall from him, who remembered her neighbor, who remembered the secret whisperings about what was going on 2 blocks away, who remembered the news of Hiroshima, was now 82 years old and hiking over a wooded ridge in Tennessee. She was part of a chain reaction that began long ago, and she was trying to restore a happy moral order before it's too late. You may not agree with her version of moral order. And I've been asked, what did Megan, Michael, and Greg actually do by breaking into this site? Did they have any impact? Or did this break-in at Y12 amount to a stunt? And my answer is no. They did not stop Y12. No, they did not eliminate a single nuclear warhead from the planet. No, they did not stop the flow of money to maintain and modernize our nuclear arsenal. But they triggered the curiosity of an undereducated journalist who then wrote a book. And they are the reason we are all here now talking about the subject, perhaps empowering each other, perhaps even building bridges. So I want to thank you for listening, and I would be most happy to hear any questions you have, any comments, and I do love criticism too, so I'd be happy to hear that as well. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to take your questions.
All right, good job. Any questions right now? Yeah, right here at the back. Microphone coming at you, please.
What do you think of the realistic possibilities are for legislation that might change the protocol for launching a nuclear weapon? Because there's been some discussion about is it responsible right now the way it is for the president? Anybody can just launch it at will.
Yeah, I think the prospects of legislation of that kind are slim to none. There has been a bill introduced by Ed Markey, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and Representative Ted Lieu from California, that would make a law that would make it so that the only way the president could launch a first nuclear strike, like an unprovoked nuclear strike, a preemptive strike, would be with a vote in Congress. Because right now the president has the sole authority to launch whenever he wants. I don't anticipate this becoming law, but nevertheless there are people in Congress who are at least trying to get the topic out there, that this is you might argue, an outsized power the president has. And actually the most compelling argument, or the most interesting argument against kind of this sole authority is a Second Amendment argument, that the spirit of the Second Amendment was kind of an equal distribution of arms among the populace, that no one person had an enormous amount of power relative to another citizen. And there is one citizen in the US that has the ultimate power to destroy the world, and perhaps that's a Second Amendment issue. I think that's really interesting. So there is legislation that's out there and been sponsored. I can't imagine it ever coming to a vote, though.
Questions? Anybody else? Yes, sir, right here. Here comes the microphone right at you.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. In fact, I used to work at Oak Ridge National Lab just over the hill.
Okay.
I wanted to just mention one thing that I think you did not, was that all the labs are run by contractors, not U.S. government employees. So I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about what happened at Y-12 after the break-in, what the consequences of that were.
Sure.
The other thing I wanted to point out, though, DOE does maintain the nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons are just kind of like the cars we drive. You've got to have places to maintain those and keep them safe, just like you do your auto mechanic and driving your car. And also within the DOE, you've got the NNSA, National Nuclear Security Agency, which is doing a lot around the world to both bring in orphan sources and to try to get orphan sources under management and control, and also educating people in the US as well as internationally on how to maintain control and keep safe nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. So there's a positive side to that as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, the site that these three reactors broke into, one of the missions is to dismantle nuclear weapons, to take them apart, the disposition of nuclear weapons. I should note that, and you can see DOE and then NNSA, which is, and this is one of my favorite bits of Washington jargon, a semi-autonomous agency within DOE. And you can see there's 9 offices under the NNSA, and part of that is non-proliferation. Unfortunately, in the recent years, funding for non-proliferation has been going down as the funding for refurbishment and modernization of the arsenal has been going up. Your first point about contractors, yeah, the top 2 federal departments that rely most on private contractors, number 1 is DOD, Department of Defense, and number 2 is the Department of Energy. These labs and these plants are managed and operated by private contractors, for-profit enterprises in most cases. And that is really one of the reasons why this Y-12 site was, I think, vulnerable, is because there were some corners that were cut in the name of profit and budgets, and that private contractors had a relationship with their federal overseers that was kind of eyes on, hands off, that they were self-policing, self-enforcing. And so you have these for-profit contractors who are managing themselves with kind of limited oversight from the government, which allowed a kind of culture of complacency to develop at Y-12. There were several contractors involved in the management and operation of Y-12, but because they were kind of self-policing, At the time of the break-in, Y-12 was experiencing over 1,000 false alarms every day, caused by the breeze, by wildlife, by foliage. And so what was one or two more alarms going off that day? And that's why they were dismissed. There was a 6-month maintenance backlog for security tools at this site, because no one was really riding herd on this for-profit contractor. The camera that should have caught them, the camera that was trained on the section of fence where they were intruding, had been out of commission for 6 months. It just wasn't working. There was a maintenance backlog. Of course, Megan, Michael, and Greg would say, well, that is the gentle touch of God, that of course that camera was out, that allowed them to get in. Of course, someone like me comes in and says, well, it seems like these private contractors maybe were not overseen in a rigorous manner. And there are problems at other sites too, but Y-12 is the site I know best. So thank you for bringing up that important point. These are DOE sites, government sites, but they are the province of these companies that specialize in the management and operation of highly technical facilities.
Any other questions? Yeah, right here at the back. We'll go Hillary right here at the back. Bob, that's what you can go back. You can do this one first, and then we'll go back here.
Here.
Thank you. One way I've looked at the situation that we're in with these nuclear weapons is trying to keep the lid on. And I guess the whole range of treaties that we're part of, at least some of them, is the means by which we do that, the public at large, through these treaties. So you think of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, you think of the Non-Proliferation Treaties, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not really current about those anymore. I guess I never was, but in any case, I'm really behind on them. Do you feel that those treaties that we're party to, and I know we haven't signed them all, are we really in command of keeping the lid on this situation, or have you discovered that, well, you know, there are all sorts of loopholes here that a country as powerful as ours could take advantage of?
Well, you know, in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, those 100+ countries that I mentioned that are signing this week this treaty to ban nuclear weapons think that we and the other nuclear powers are delinquent on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that it required us to in good faith, begin the process of negotiating disarmament, which is kind of mealy-mouthed language to begin with, but they think that 40, 45 years is not, that kind of lag time in getting rid of our arsenals is acting in bad faith. So they actually, a majority of countries in the world think we're delinquent on the NPT. As far as keeping the lid on things, I mean, you could argue the most important treaty going right now is New START, which is our latest iteration of an agreement with the Russians, which those terms have to be met by next year, and that treaty then expires in 2021. Are we going to have a follow-on to that treaty? I hope so. And those treaties have always been kind of lowering the lid on the number of deployed weapons and deployed launchers. But even more important than that, those treaties have allowed for an inspection regime. The Russians can come and look at our things, and we can go and look at their things and make sure everyone's kind of complying. And it would be, I think it would be kind of disastrous if that inspection agreement went away. We have a few years until we figure out what's going on. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty we have signed, but it still remains unratified. And there was going to be a push, or there has been a push to, at the end of the Obama administration, to get the Senate to kind of take a look at this treaty again. This is the treaty that bans testing. We have not ratified that treaty. We're obliging it, we are obeying it, but it has not entered into force. So it's a patchwork of treaties, and it's imperfect, but it's really all we have to work with, you could argue. So, you know, every 5 years the nations who are signatories to the NPT get together at the UN to discuss the progress and develop some kind of what they call an outcome document to say this is where we're going in terms of our disarmament. The last one of those was in 2015, and that conference broke down. There wasn't an agreement on the path forward. which is not great news. The next one is not till 2020. What will the world be like at that point? Where will we be in our vision of the world in terms of the nuclear age? I don't know. But right now, kind of the X factor in this are these nations that on Wednesday will sign this treaty saying these weapons are illegal to possess. And how do we let that affect our behavior, our vision? The US government is against this treaty, but there are 100+ countries who are signing it. It's going to be a source of tension, I think, for the foreseeable future. So an imperfect patchwork that for now is keeping the lid on things, but then you talk about a country like North Korea, where our last agreements and talks with them have broken down years ago, and now they have an ICBM and a miniaturized warhead, and they've been far ahead of our predictions of where they'd be, and it's only a matter of time before you can marry them. But the treaty process or the diplomacy process is really our only option. If we start some kind of military engagement on the Korean Peninsula, that could spiral into a nuclear exchange, and then all bets are off. I mean, that's the concern. Some people, I'm not a security expert, I'm not a North Korea expert, but when people ask me about it, and ask, is North Korea just going to fire a weapon at us? Are they just going to fire an ICBM at us and nuke San Francisco? I don't think so. They're a nation state. They're interested in their own survival. The regime there is interested in their own survival. My concern is that this tough talk sets the stage for a misunderstanding that results in a conventional military conflict that then backs Kim Jong-un into a corner, and he recognizes his regime is going down, and so what the heck, let's take some people with us. And that's when he would use the nuclear option. That's a long and depressing answer to your fairly simple question, but that's where my mind went. So I don't know, I hope that diplomacy and perhaps even some kind of treaty works out in that regard, but till then we just have this patchwork that you mentioned.
We got a question back there.
I did, but now I'm just hopeless. I guess just as an action-oriented civilian, what would you recommend, outside of, I guess it's the North Korea question of, do you ever feel like there will be enough trust to get North Korea to the table, even if we didn't have, president using such fiery language? I mean, because that seems like we'll have the weapons as long as they exist. Like, we're not going to get rid of our weapons just for an example, if North Korea still has them, right? So can you give us a little hope? And if not, what should we do as citizens, maybe as we leave here? I mean, what's the positive angle, if there is one? That's in the nuclear talk.
That's a great question. What can an individual do? And unfortunately, all I have to offer you are platitudes that I'm going to try and make sound wise. Because, as I mentioned, you can't really change anything about your own life like you can if you're concerned about the environment or whatever, to feel like you have some agency over it. You could break into a weapons facility, but I wouldn't advise it. I wouldn't advise that. I think just being aware and being engaged and working at a local level. The thing about the nuclear weapons complex that the gentleman mentioned about private contractors and these labs and plants, every corner of this country has a facility that is somehow connected to the nuclear weapons complex. Whether it's Y-12, whether it's the Los Alamos lab, whether it's the Savannah River site in South Carolina, whether it's the Kansas City plant, there's a big facility in Amarillo. There are silos all over the Upper Plains. There are Trident submarines in Washington State and in Georgia, military bases that have nuclear weapons or nuclear capable machinery. So, it's a local issue in that sense. And it's also, for an elected official, a constituent issue, because there are jobs in nuclear weapons. There's an economy around nuclear weapons. There are whole towns that exist because there are bomber bases that are located there. We have found, there was an agreement a few years ago. We have 450 ICBM silos still in those states that I mentioned earlier. There are plenty of military people who think we don't need that many. And in fact, there was an agreement to get rid of 50 of them. But there was pushback because that means the elimination of jobs, which an elected official might not want to do. And so there is this, I think there's a kind of a point of vulnerability there for the average citizen to get in and say, is something being perpetuated purely from an economical reason that's somewhere in driving distance of me, or that my congressman or congresswoman represents in some way? And maybe you could be active at that hyper-specific local level. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that would be a satisfying endeavor. This is such an abstract and profound topic that you have to distill it down to something that you can wrap your brain around. And if, thinking of nuclear annihilation is too much and, as they say, would ruin your day, think about the facility, the plant, the lab, the congressman that you may have that's on a particular committee, an armed services committee that's in charge of authorizing all of the military stuff we do, and engaging with that elected official. I wish I had a better tactic than that, some kind of revelation. But I think if I knew how to solve this, I would be on my way to a Nobel Peace Prize, and I just don't have that. So I don't know if that answers all your questions or if that's positive enough, but there are local opportunities to render this kind of enormous, depressing topic at a local level that is comprehensible, I think.
I know we got more questions, but we have also a book signing to do, so please come over, visit with Dan, and purchase this book and let him sign it for you. Let's welcome and thank Dan Zak for being with us.
Thank you very much.